Ben, we're so honored to have you with us today. I'd like to turn it over to you for opening comments.
Well, thanks very much, Kathy. Kathy and Janine, it's nice to be with old friends, and the rest of you, it's nice to make new friends. I'm really excited about your program, and I'd love to see the film on the Constitution that you described a minute ago, and I hope I can sometime. I'll try to add to it today. I guess I'm not going to give lengthy opening remarks because I want to get as quickly as we can to questions and answers. But I'm sure in your look at the Constitution and the US government, one of the things that immediately becomes apparent is that not everything that we take for granted as part of the American political and even governmental system is envisioned in the Constitution. Not that it's prohibited, but it's not envisioned. I mean, political parties are not mentioned in the Constitution. Well, the committees of the Congress are not really mentioned in the Constitution either. And indeed, the initial thought of the founders was that the decisions of the Congress would be made by the whole Congress voting as a body. That quickly became impractical for reasons I imagine you can understand. The first committee to be established by the Congress, as important, was the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee determines under what circumstances a piece of legislation will come to the floor and be debated on and be considered and be enacted into law. Those were the first committees in both the House and the Senate. Now, to get a little more sort of theoretical about the Congress, the committees of the Congress, I would describe paradoxically, are sort of the indispensable obstacles to progress. You can't really organize the work of the Congress without having committees, because not every member of Congress can become an expert on every subject. There's a philosophical argument that says that gets worse and worse and worse as the government gets bigger, bigger, and bigger, and I agree with that argument. But nonetheless, you don't expect every member of Congress to be an expert on everything. My district was agricultural. I cared about urban housing, but I was not going to become an expert on it. The people from Florida needed to know the space program better than I needed to know the space program. So there's a very good argument for a division of labor within the Congress of the United States, and that's what the committees actually constitute. But I said they're the indispensable obstacle, and I meant that to be somewhat paradoxical. We now have over 200 committees and subcommittees in the Congress of the United States. Every one of them has a chairperson and a ranking member. The ranking member is the senior person in the other party. And there is a tendency always to sort of build little empires in all those places. So the committees can become obstacles to actually having the efficient management of the Congress of the United States, if you will, especially as we add committees and add subcommittees and add jurisdiction, and members want to be on specific committees for narrow purposes. As I mentioned, the original concept of the founders was that the Congress would come together and they would decide everything as a large group. The more you have committees, the further you get away from that vision. And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. In fact, I don't know how we would run the Congress without committees. I'm just saying that there are downsides to the committee process. Chairmen build their own little empires on their own committees. On the Republican side, one of the things we did when I was in the leadership, as you're probably aware, is we decided to term limit the chairman of the committees. The Democrats have not done that. We didn't term limit people in terms of how long they could serve in the Congress, which many people want to do, but we did term limit them in terms of how long a chairman could be the chairman of the same committee. And that is to sort of get away from this idea that the committee serves the chairman as opposed to serving the needs of the entire body. I think that I was very involved in making that change happen. Speaker Gingrich presided over it. I think it's a good change. every 2 years, there is somebody in one of those committee positions that doesn't like it because they've been chairman and they want to stay. Occasionally, there are exceptions made, and they usually have a pretty good reason. This time, Congresswoman Virginia Fox from North Carolina was given what they call a waiver so that she could be the chairman of the Education Committee for one more term. She had done it in the past, and it was perceived that she was indispensable in that role. Doesn't mean she's going to do it forever, but she is the exception to the rule. So that's kind of how the committees, I view the committees. They are indispensable to the functioning of the Congress. They are also a great obstacle to progress and can cause great difficulties and can be significantly abused. A lot of rules that surround them. Maybe you'll want to ask some questions about these, but there have been some happenings in recent days that matter. For instance, when Speaker McCarthy became Speaker, actually before he became Speaker, one of his promises that he'd made over a year before was that if he became Speaker, he would constitute a new committee on China. And he has done that. Keep in mind, we already have a Foreign Affairs Committee, we have an Armed Services Committee, and we have the Trade Subcommittee of Ways and Means, which deal with most aspects of our relationship with China. But Speaker McCarthy thought we needed more because of the competition commercially, politically, and perhaps militarily that he sees coming from China. So we have a new committee chaired by Congressman Gallagher from Wisconsin, a really outstanding member of Congress, in my opinion. That's a new thing in this Congress. They haven't really started work yet. Another controversy that has developed began really in the last Congress. You probably all paid attention to the January 6th committee and the Congress and the decision of Speaker Pelosi basically to veto certain Republican members on that committee. That's a violation of precedent. It's not a violation of the Constitution or of the rules of the House. But traditionally, the parties get to choose their own members on committees. And when Speaker Pelosi decided that she would not allow certain Republicans to serve on that committee, she broke with that precedent. Well, now Speaker McCarthy, the Republicans are in charge, has followed that precedent by removing 2 Congress people from the Intelligence Committee and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from the Foreign Affairs Committee. And there's a similar argument that says this is not a good thing. The parties should be able to choose their own members. I tend to agree with that, although in the case of the Intelligence Committee, the Speaker has an overriding responsibility to protect American security. But still, we're seeing an erosion of this principle that the parties choose their own members of the committees. And that's an important thing, because if we believe that we should have political parties that can actually make commitments to the voters and act on those commitments when they get in government, you can't denude them of their ability to have members in positions to follow through on those promises. So I think Speaker McCarthy is going to be a fine speaker. I understand why he did what he did on the Intelligence Committee. I'm less comfortable with him removing Ilhan Omar, although I disagree with her very passionately on everything. I know her quite well from Minnesota. She's not on my page on anything. Still, that's the Democrats' business. If they want her on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think she should be there. But those are decisions that we have made in this Congress already that are sort of new and affect the committee structure. So with that, I'm going to cut it short because I was in the House of Representatives, not the Senate. If I was a senator, I'd probably go on talking for another hour or so, but we don't filibuster in the House of Representatives. So Kathy and Janine, why don't I turn it back to you?
Well, thank you, Vin. That was a great overview of committees, and I love your characterization of indispensable obstacles. That's just, I think that's a brilliant way to sum up committees. And Janine, I know that I'm sure you've got some questions. Do you want to jump in here and ask a few before we turn it over to Lindsay
Sure.
and Jewel?
Great. Yes. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me
Yes.
well? Okay, terrific. Thank you, Mr. Weber. That was awesome. Very, very informative. And so now I'm going to break it down a little bit. I always think about the students that are on, and I come in to sort of summarize what you said and also make it applicable to today, though this was very current in what you had to say today. Let's break it down a little bit in regard to um, the rules committees, but I think also that okay, look, everybody knows who listens to these podcasts that I wish that it were the day when congressmen and women didn't have offices and they could when their desks in the 19th century were just their office was on the floor because
Sure.
I think that we would get so much more done and in a collaborative manner instead of the sort of isolatory my team against yours, and then, as you say, the kind of empirical thinking that can happen within a committee. Though I understand the need for committees, so I'm like you, right? It's our government is huge, but I miss the day of seeing a collaboration on the floor, and also for the American people to see that. I think the more isolatory committees become, and the more isolatory the political process becomes, it feeds into this sort of isolatory political thinking among the American populace. So to the point that when we actually do see people on the floor doing just your basic negotiation like they do in the House, in the Commons, over there in Britain, what we saw when they were trying to change the some of the rules at the beginning of the year here on the floor, that used to just be typical day on the Congress floor. They would debate. They'd have rigorous debate, and they would then vote, and not everybody would get their way. And I thought that was really true to the democratic process. And I think committees become they get away from that principle. But my specific question with the committees is how, so the students can understand too, how does it work? So you mentioned briefly a rules committee. I don't want to go off in the weeds with that, but I guess the rules committee creates the different kinds of committees, maybe, or what the rules are for the committees. But like a bill, we always ask the kids, what would you like to change in your neighborhood? So let's say they write a petition. They want more lights in their neighborhood, better electrical grid. And so that's taken up to DC. And now there's a committee on electrical grids. So they go in and they discuss the electrical grids within the committee. What's the next process? Because it seems to be what we keep hearing is these back deals are made in the rooms, that the House majority leader just kind of figures it all out, and then they shuffle it out and say, this is how you're going to vote. And then the majority votes, and there's really no real dialogue about it. So it seems like the process, as you said in the beginning, of the entire body really understanding what's in the bill seems to lack in this committee process. So once the electrical grid bid gets into the committee, does it then go out? What happens from there, so our students understand? Where does the bill go there afterwards, after committee? Or does committee decide whether it should go to the floor? How does that work?
Sure. A lot there, Janine. I'll answer the question directly first, and then I'll backtrack just a little bit if I can. When a committee reports a bill, it goes to the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee then determines under what circumstances it's going to be considered by the full House of Representatives or the full Senate. The Rules Committee in the House is much more powerful than the Rules Committee in the Senate, for the simple reason that there's 4 times as many people you have to deal with, and so they need to have tighter rules. But the rule that they would consider the electrical grid bill, for instance, would include what kind of amendments can be offered. Some bills are considered under closed rules and no amendments can be offered. You vote it up or down. Some bills are considered under modified closed rules, which means you have to go to the Rules Committee as a member of Congress and say, I want to offer an amendment that would do X, Y, and Z to this bill. And the Rules Committee will determine whether or not you will be allowed to offer that amendment. And there's a lot of politics involved in that. I mean, it can be as simple as we have to look at the amount of time it takes, and so we can't allow all these amendments. Or it can be The Rules Committee doesn't like the bill themselves. So they're going to not permit an amendment which might improve it. But the Rules Committee then determines what's going to actually happen on the floor. The Speaker in the House of Representatives has enormous latitude over the Rules Committee. And in fact, when we constitute committees, normally there's an attempt to make the ratios in the committees similar to the ratios in the whole House of Representatives. And so as now we have a very closely divided House, most committees would have a very closely divided committee system. But the Speaker almost always makes an exception of the Rules Committee and gets a 2-to-1 majority for his or her party so that they can control the circumstances under which the bill is considered. Let me broaden back to the beginning of your question, Janine, because I think it's a really good point you make. You know, one of the things we saw for the last many years, first of all, Nancy Pelosi was elected to Congress when I was in the Congress. So I know her reasonably well. And for that matter, even though we're in different parties, Kathy mentioned that I was chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy. I have to give the Speaker Pelosi credit. She was a great backer of the National Endowment for Democracy, and she's a supporter of democracy in China. I don't agree with her on much of anything else, but I did like that. However, one of the things said in praise of Nancy Pelosi as a speaker was that she never brought a bill to the floor unless she had the votes to pass it. And that's meant almost always as a compliment. But think about what that means. It means the decisions on the bill were all made already. That, and which is the point that Janine makes. There's not real debate on the floor of the House if the Speaker already knows in advance that the bill is going to pass. And that's the way things have been working in the House of Representatives for a while. Now contrast that in current events with the last Senate, which was divided, as we probably know, 50-50, 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats. The Vice President was able to break the tie. They agreed on rules for the committees in the Senate that said if there's a tie vote coming out of the Senate in a committee, it doesn't kill the bill automatically goes to the floor. Very different than the way the House of Representatives has worked in recent years. And as a result, we had lots of debate on the floor of the United States Senate, and a lot of the priorities, even of the majority, were defeated. That's why Senator Manchin became so important. And it frustrates people because they don't always get what they want, but I tend to think that the spirit of Janine's question is exactly right. The framers intended for the Congress to debate these matters. The committees should try to streamline the process and add expertise to the process, because the chairman of the Agriculture Committee should know more about agriculture policy than other members, but they shouldn't preclude debate on the floor of either the House or the Senate. And I think that that's what's been happening. I was in the minority in the House way back in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan was president. Tip O'Neill, the Democrat from Massachusetts, was the Speaker of the House. We debated Reagan's tax cuts on the floor of the House, and they passed, even though the Democrats controlled the House, because enough Democrats switched to vote for Reagan's tax bill. That's just one example, but my point is we had real debate, and it did affect the outcome. That's not been the case in the House of Representatives recently.
And I think that's what the Freedom Caucus was making a fuss about, because they thought no more, we need to have a presence in these committees, and we want a debate. I'd written a Truth Act, which was very similar about 10 years ago. Okay, so let's just, I want to get this to everybody else, but just to recap, the electrical grid is a bill that wants to get made. I'm sure every House of Representative has, from their constituents, people in their neighborhood that they represent, they have all kinds of ideas. So that's 435 of them, right? But not every idea of the constituents can really probably get considered. So if we were to build a cartoon on this and to draw it, if 435 people go with ideas from their constituents, how do all of those go into a committee? Does the committee just take on one subject, like a electrical grid bill, and then, for what I'm understanding, the committee would kind of do they, and how does it work in the room? Do they just kind of debate it and say, yeah, let's take this to the rules committee, and then take it to the floor for
Sure.
discussion, or do they write up the bill in the room, like what they want the bill to be, so sort of bullet point? And what is, and
Yeah.
I guess I'm still a little bit confused about the rudiment, the basics here. Is if the electrical grid bill from, say, Minnesota goes into committee, and they do what, and we have to answer quickly because I want everyone else to have time, please. But they do what with it, and then in the rules committee will say yes or no, and we're hearing different scenarios that if it were Nancy Pelosi, it wouldn't even go to the floor. But what is typical now? Does it ever go? Well, I'm still a little confused on just basic. What this is the first step, second step, third step, fourth step. So if you can answer that quickly, and then I'll toss it
Sure.
to others, because I
need,
could ask all day.
good question. We need to back up in the process of the committee's work. When the committee starts work, and the committees have started work this last couple of weeks, the first thing they do is usually not to mark up a bill. They'll start holding hearings. And for instance, the Energy and Commerce Committee will hear testimony from various officials in the Department of Energy about the electrical grid and about other things that they care about. They will also call public witnesses, and you can ask to testify. They don't have to let you, but you can ask, and a lot of different people do testify and come in front of the committee and say, hey, I've got expertise in this area. We've got this problem. I'd like the committee to look at it. So a lot of the committee's work is spent trying to inform themselves about different issues that come before them that they don't know anything about, really. Just as an example, I was on the Appropriations Committee. I was also on the subcommittee on Labor, Education, and Health and Human Services, which appropriates all the money for biomedical research and other health-related agencies. I was on that committee when we first heard of this disease called AIDS. We spent a lot of time with people coming in front of our committee to tell us, what is this? Tell us about it. How does it spread? What can we do about it? Is there a possibility of vaccination? Learning what you can do about it before you actually get to actually vote on legislation that might affect. I just use that as an example because it's a new thing. But people try to bring new issues that they care about, electrical grid being a very big issue these days, in front of the committee, and the committee will hold hearings and they'll listen to experts. And sometimes those experts can be at odds with each other, which that usually makes for pretty good television drama. And then at the end of the process, as you get nearer the end of the process, that's when the committee will take up a bill that has been submitted by a member of the committee, and they will try to mark up a bill consistent or informed by what they've heard in their committee hearing process and all of the experts. That bill then, if it fails in committee, it just dies. If it passes in committee, it goes, as I said, to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee determines under what circumstances it will be considered on the floor, and they send it to the floor, and it's put on the, quote, calendar and to be debated and voted upon. Occasionally, the leadership of the House, more recently in frequent years, doesn't want it to come out anyway. And so the Speaker leans on the Rules Committee not to give it a rule. That has happened more often in recent years than not.
Well, that's really interesting how that works. I think that's actually our word that we love here on the show. Fascinating, to really understand the process. And what's really alarming is this kind of pressure on the Rules Committee that can prevent the voice of America, who may want something from their neighborhood to be fixed. They'll just prevent it from going to the floor to a vote. So that's kind of frightening. But it's just, so I guess the goal here is, because, if we're not knowledgeable as constituents, we don't know what to ask our representatives to do. And I think that's where the Freedom Caucus was interesting. Not that I agree with everything they say or do either, but they were standing up for something. And I think that it's good for constituents to know that something that they really, really care about and put a lot of time into may get shut down by some strong arming of the rules committee, and it never
Yeah.
gets to the voice of the actual debate. So it's only when knowledge is power. It's only when we know kind of the machinations of what happens behind the scenes
Right.
that we can.
You need a rules committee. I mean, you need a committee that decides the procedures under which a bill is going to be considered. But what the problem is when the rules committee decides it's going to become a mini Congress, and they are not simply concerned with the proper and efficient functioning of the Congress and proper consideration of the bills that have been generated by the other committees, but they decide they're going to use their own judgment on the substance of that legislation. And that's in my view, a
That's when it goes
misuse of the
awry.
Rules Committee.
Yeah, really informative. Can you answer something in 30 seconds? The Freedom Caucus was asking for single subject bills, and this is kind of what my Truth Act was all about, limiting the bill numbers to 30 pages. So that passed, if I understand that McCarthy was now the bills they wanted that single subject. I saw that. Did you? So does that mean a lot of times these bills in committee become omnibus bills at the committee because they were asking for the bills to be single subject? If you could answer that just super quickly, and then we'll pass
Yeah, the trend toward omnibus bills where everything is considered in one big bill has been getting worse and worse and worse and worse. The funding of the government should take place on 12 specific appropriations bills that fund. That's how the Appropriations Committee is organized in the House of Representatives. 12 different: Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture, Department of Health and Human Services. But what's happened, and I think, I don't agree with Freedom Caucus on everything either, but I think that they identified a problem here, which is in recent years, the leadership has waited till the last minute, not passed those individual bills, lumped them all together in one and said, you got to pass this now or the government's going to shut down. And so people really, you hear the phrase, nobody has read this bill. Nobody's going to read a 4,000-page bill in 24 hours. I mean, it's just not possible. So they have a point. The government, it doesn't necessarily follow that the size and scope of government will change if you have individual bills, but it's a lot easier to find things that are duplicative, unnecessary, or that just haven't worked very well. So the notion of single subject bills, and particularly individual spending bills as opposed to omnibus bills, I think is a very important reform. Both parties really should embrace it.
Well, James Madison would have loved that. He said, if the laws are so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, it's of no avail for men to elect men of their own choice. I paraphrase, but I got a lot of that right. Because the bills are so big, no one understands it. Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to pass it on now.
If you could paraphrase that, Janine, you're way ahead of me.
Well, that was in my Truth Act. I heard that. I thought, oh my gosh, it's so relevant to today, and that's one of the big impetuses that I wanted to found Constituting America, because it just made so much sense to me.
And it contributes to this phenomenon that we've seen, that people don't have confidence in their government. It's hard to have confidence in something that is so complicated and large that you can't understand it. And that's maybe simplistic, but that is my view. And you see it in the polling all the time. People do not have confidence in the government. They do not have confidence in the direction of the country. And there's a lot of reasons for that, a whole lot. Some of them secular, some of them not. But this is the conduct of the Congress, the way that they handle spending and other legislation contributes to that lack of confidence.
Yes, it's amen to that. Okay, I'm passing it on. Thank you. I could talk all day, but I can't. So I'm passing it on. Thank you.
All right, hello, Mr.
thank you,
Member. I'm
Janine.
going to try to get through some of these questions really quickly so we can get to Lindsay. The power that these committees have, we've established that they've developed post-Constitution, but is the power drawn from the constitutional power given to the Speaker, or is it just, is it that the Constitution gives the House the right to regulate how it's going to operate, and then that's what has turned into the committees?
Yeah, that's basically right. Constitution is not particularly prescriptive about how the House should be organized. They do constitute the Speaker. The Speaker's got, and the Speaker is the Speaker of the whole House. You know, we think of the Speaker as the leader of the party of his or her choice, but the Constitution doesn't say anything about that. The Constitution says that the Speaker is the Speaker of the whole House, and has the authority to organize the House within reasonable limits. The membership is supposed to make these decisions, but what we're talking about here is the difficulty of getting a body that now includes 435 members to come to a collective decision without some kind of rule.
And then this is a totally different topic around the committees, but the party influence around committees and what committees are going to bring to the Speaker to be able to bring to vote. How much of it is, how much pressure is there from the national political parties on sticking to the platform or bringing bills that are going to positively influence future elections on members?
That's a very, very good question. And it's a complicated question because of course the party platforms don't have any direct authority, but people do pay attention to them. You know, I've been a delegate to multiple national conventions, and I've been on the platform committee a couple times. And I was Senator Dole's liaison to the platform committee when he was the Republican nominee. And they pay a lot of attention to it. And when members of a party deviate substantially from an important position that the party has taken in a platform, they will be called on the carpet by their own constituents. So the influence is indirect, but it's real. And again, best example that I can think of, I go back to my days in we passed the Reagan tax cuts. We had platforms in the 1980s committing the Republican Party to being a tax cutting party. George H.W. Bush, who I admired enormously, agreed to a tax increase in 1991. And it split the party right down the middle. I mean, it was a hugely problematic thing because people like me said, we promised our constituents that the Republican Party would not raise taxes. And we did split the party, and it probably cost Bush's reelection. So, but I'm trying to answer the question when you understand, it is an indirect pressure, but it can be very, very real.
And here's the follow-up question to that and the last question. And thank you for that answer. It gives so much insight having lived it like that. Is that we see today, and as we progress towards more modernity and more technological advancements, we see a more homogeneous political opinion across the nation per political party. It seems like there is less, it doesn't just seem like it, polling shows it as well, and pretty much people just flat out say it, that there is national issues which there's more homogeneous opinion on across the party lines across the nation. So representatives who are called to represent their individual constituents are oftentimes seen more like representing their entire team, all Democrats or all Republicans. Is there having been in Congress and a little bit before we had so much social media and things like that, do you see that some committee members, some members of Congress may have slightly different opinions? They may not be so left or right. They may have a nuanced opinion or opinion that's really localized, but they don't speak it or they don't bring it, and they end up back in the party because they don't think their opinion is going to make much of a difference if they break from party line, and they won't be reelected if they break from party line, and they don't see utility in it.
You know, there's much more pressure, I think, to adhere to the party line, if you will. There's a lot of impacts that we could discuss there. The media has eroded the notion of individual localized districts and things like that, and created two big national parties, and it's not. It polarizes the country quite a bit, I think. Wasn't always that way, but it's become more that way all the time now. And it's hard to get out of it. The media basically tells voters that their member is deviating from the party line and that they shouldn't ever deviate from the party line. That's in my view not a good thing. It's not a good thing, but it's hard to attribute that to anything structural in the government, in my view. It has much more to do with the media and other political factors that just make it very difficult for people to deviate from the party line.
Yeah, thank you very much for all those answers. We packed a bunch of information into a few minutes. I'd like to pass it on now.
Thank you. And first off, thank you, Mr. Weber, for joining us to help kind of
My pleasure.
unpack the complexities of committees here. So to start, like you said, the overarching goal of committees makes perfect sense. I couldn't imagine, how long it would take the House to wade through all of the issues sent their way. But my question for you is, how is the minority represented in a committee? Are there methods for ensuring that one side isn't completely drowned out to prevent that kind of isolatory structure that Janine was referring to earlier?
Well, as I mentioned, the tradition, and it is just a tradition, is that the parties will negotiate ratios. And so the minority party is guaranteed a ratio of members that is roughly similar to its representation in the body as a whole. And the second piece of it, which we did talk about, and I'll talk about again, is the party is given the authority to name its own members of those committees. And that's, I think both of those things are important, but it also, the undermining of the power of the minority, in my view, goes back to the last question we answered, which is there's a uniformity demanded of members. So in a way, in a committee, there are going to be exceptions to this, but it doesn't matter if you have only a 1-vote majority in committee. If everybody in your party votes the same, the minority doesn't have a way of making an impact. Let me make another point. The Republicans took control of the House of Representatives in 1994 for the first time in 40 years. One of the things I always talk about when I talk to people is it's not just that in the previous 40 years, the Republicans had never won control of the House. They never went into an election thinking they could win control of the House. The Republicans were trying to gain seats to improve their ratios in committees, but they never thought that they were going to win control of the House. Okay, think about elections since 1994. We have rarely gone into an election in which both parties did not have some reason to believe they might win control of the House. Now, at one level of political theory, I'd say that's very good. We believe in competitive elections. We should have competitive elections. But it's not an unmixed blessing. It means that every issue that comes up, both parties look at it and say, aha, that could be the issue that gains us or loses us control of the House. And it's the competitiveness of the Congress, which again, most of us would say in an ideal world, that's a good thing. It also has put a premium on loyalty to the party line, because any real deviation could conceivably cost you control of the House or the Senate. We saw it really clearly in the Senate in the last 2 years.
Right, absolutely. And that's really interesting to point out, kind of the beautiful aspect of the competitive nature there.
Yeah.
And
well, I was, and Kathy knows, I was very much part of the effort to make us a majority. We believed we needed to be competitive. I was very much all for that. I still think on balance it's better than not, but you got to acknowledge there are some problems connected to it too. It's not a perfect world.
Absolutely. And with that same line of discussion there, what was your most rewarding experience serving on a committee?
Oh, wow. It's kind of, I did a couple of things. First of all, I was one of the leaders on the Republican side in ascending to President Reagan the first sanctions bill against the apartheid government of South Africa that President Reagan signed into law. Highly controversial at that time, but I was involved in it, and we ended up making it bipartisan, but we made a lot of enemies from people who had a different view. But that opened it up. It's disconcerting to me to see that South Africa is doing badly. I don't know if you pay attention to it, but we had all hoped that this country, once they integrated and stopped the practice of apartheid, would be a model of a multiracial success story in Africa. That's not been the case. But you know, helping to break down apartheid was a very important thing. Some of it's a little more mundane than that. I helped sort of get funding for a program I had an agricultural district. I helped get funding for a program that developed laser guided application of chemicals and seed and fertilizer to agriculture. This sounds very mundane, but believe me, it was very important. We both reduced the amount of chemicals and things that we put on agricultural land and increased the yield, which is no small thing because America feeds the world.
Absolutely. And that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And on another note, more recently, with the 15 ballot election of Speaker McCarthy, I wondered if there were any other historical instances of the House struggling to elect a speaker.
Well, the last multi-ballot fight for the Speaker of the House was 100 years ago exactly, and it took weeks. I don't remember exactly how many ballots, but it took many weeks. I had a conversation with a couple of Speaker McCarthy's top lieutenants going in this because they said we've never been through a multi-ballot process in any of our lifetimes. And they said the closest thing we can think of to that is multi-ballot endorsing conventions in politics. And Minnesota has been a convention state. We endorse candidates in conventions. I was endorsed on the 7th ballot the first time that I ran for Congress. My mother was the county chairman for a candidate for governor who got endorsed on the 16th ballot at his convention. And there have been longer ones than that. Virginia, Kathy's familiar with Virginia. Virginia has massive conventions. So I tried to give them, the Speaker's office, some tips on how they should organize themselves on the floor for a multi-ballot process. Not on any of the substantive stuff. I wasn't involved in what the rules should be, but how they deployed their supporters on the floor, how they would organize themselves, and the whole goal was to prevent whatever number of dissidents there were, and we didn't know if it would be 5 or 10. It ended up being 20. And I said, the goal is to not let that number ever grow, because if it starts to grow, it'll all unravel on Kevin McCarthy. And whatever we did it right. And there are all sorts of little things that you learn at conventions that applied on the floor of the House and prevented the coalescing of an opposition to McCarthy. So I was glad to do that.
Wow, and that's really interesting. I know I was eagerly watching to see what would happen with that, but there's so many different aspects of it.
Yeah. I'll just tell you one thing. This is convention politics, but one of the first things they told me is that we're going to have Kevin sit in the cloakroom and bring in individual members to meet with him. And I said, my every experience in a convention is that that's a mistake. You want the candidate to be right out there in the middle of everything so that everybody can see him. And if he can manage it, have a big smile on his face. And they did that. They put Kevin in the middle of the caucus so that, people could not go off and do conspiracies against Kevin McCarthy without looking at Kevin McCarthy. There's 3 or 4 other things that I suggested to them that I think were helpful too, but it's been 100 years since they've had to do that.
Right. Yeah. And then the publicity of it and the PR that you've got to think about.
Yeah.
Very good advice. Yeah. So purely hypothetical, what would the House's action be if we couldn't reach a verdict on electing a speaker? Is there some kind of plan in place?
The only, you ballot for as long as it takes for a speaker to get the majority. There are procedures, and I'm a little rusty on this, there are procedures for changing that so that it could be a plurality rather than a majority. But I'm sorry, I'm a little rusty on how the rules that actually make that happen, because remember, there really isn't a House of Representatives until you choose the speaker. So you kind of you're kind of making it up as you go along. But they've I believe historically there is a precedent for lowering the threshold from an absolute majority to a plurality, which is possible. But you're supposed to simply keep voting until you elect a speaker. You know, this is why the parallel to this is recently, which didn't go through any ballots, but that's why Speaker Gingrich resigned the speakership, is because he had, even though the Republicans had the majority, there were just enough Republicans who said they would not vote for him for speaker so that he couldn't get to 218, which is the majority. And rather than throw the whole thing into chaos, Speaker Gingrich stepped aside. The big, and we talked about that when I was talking with McCarthy's people, the big difference between now and then was that the dissidents, if you will, against Speaker Gingrich in 1998, I think it was, were more or less moderate Republicans who might have been comfortable voting for a Democrat. We weren't sure. That was not the case now. The people that were upset with McCarthy or didn't like him, if anything, were more conservative, more ideological than the speaker. And the notion that they would unite with Democrats to elect a Democrat speaker was almost inconceivable to me. So my advice was figure out procedures for toughing this out, and eventually you'll get it.
Wow, and all of
Well,
that is
thank you, Lindsay. Those are great questions. And thank you, Ben. And Lindsay, I don't want to jump in. I just want to make sure we've got time for audience questions, if you're good with that, because we've got lots of great audience questions here. And first of all, I wanted to read a note from our sponsor, Brian Ernst, who says, glad to hear he's from Minnesota. I was born and raised there. Thanks for letting me sponsor today. So Brian is a
That's
fellow
great.
Minnesotan that says hello to you.
That's
and we
great.
also want to thank Hope Mucklow and her homeschool students who are watching today. So Hope, we're really glad to have you and your students. And then to get to the questions, Sandy Thatcher asks, what kind of sanction could apply to a member of Congress who serves on a committee that has access to classified information and leaks it to a reporter or someone else, including a person who's an agent for a foreign country?
Multiple sanctions. I mean, the immediate process within the House, the House of Representatives, if you limit it to that, would be to refer it to the House Ethics Committee. The House has a committee on ethics, and that committee would debate everything pretty much behind closed doors, and they can recommend different levels of sanction against a member. They can recommend, I'm going to forget the exact word, but they can recommend a rebuke. They can go a higher level and recommend an absolute censure, or they can recommend expulsion from the House. So the Ethics Committee has the ability to sanction a member for doing the kinds of things that the question asked. But that's not all. If you're talking about dealing with foreign governments, you get into legal matters, and the Department of Justice probably could take a look at that as well. There are members of Congress are protected for what they do and say in their official capacity on the floor of the House of Representatives. But they have no ability to take that immunity outside the Congress and leak classified or secret documents to the press or anybody else, or they're subject to the same kind of prosecutions as any other spy.
Well, thank you. Now, John Holmes asks, committee chairs have been given much power. Some use this power to hold bills they don't like from committee hearings. They pigeonhole bills which die and never get discussed or vote on due to this one person, I guess being the committee chair. Isn't this denying citizens from being represented by their elected representatives? And is this not a violation of the Constitution?
No, I don't think it's a violation of the Constitution. It may be a political mistake on their part, but that's the, I mean, the recourse is the voters should vote them out. I kind of resist, and the question is sincere, and I'm not critical of the questioner, but I resist structural and procedural answers to what are political problems. You know, just because we don't get the thing, just because it doesn't work the way we want, we shouldn't change the rules or the structure of the Constitution. You vote bad people out, and if you can't do that, then our political process is not going to really work very well. So I don't think that's the case. By the way, the other side of the coin also works too. I mean, I can be critical of strong committee chairs and not like the fact that they would bottle up legislation that they don't like. They can also bring up legislation that otherwise would not get a fair hearing. And some committee members and some committee chairmen do that. They use their position to highlight issues that they think are being ignored, that the public should be allowed to see. So it kind of works both ways.
Well, thank you for that. And great question, a great answer. And then Mike Johnson asks, he says, Vin, there's always been friction between the committees and the leadership. McCarthy, like Boehner, wants to delegate more power to the committees. How will that work in the 118th? Mike Johnson.
Well, you're right. There's always friction. The committee chairs don't like anything that intrudes on their power. The speaker and the leadership don't like anything that implies that they are not in charge. And so there's always some friction. With the narrow majority that Speaker McCarthy has, I think that that's going to be a little bit of a problem for him as we go forward. Now, he's got by and large committee chairs that he likes. The chairman of the Rules Committee, Tom Coles, is an excellent member of Congress, and that will be very good. And the other committees are chaired by very good people. But you know, it's not going to be an insurmountable. It's not going to be a non-problem. Let's just say that. I think one of the things that the speaker has done, I don't know this for a fact, this is just my intuition, but you see a lot of criticism now of Republicans in getting ready to do all sorts of investigations. Well, you know, when you don't control the presidency or the Senate, there's a couple of ways that you can influence policy. One is to highlight issues through investigations. The other is to risk, you know, government shutdowns by insisting that your priorities be reflected in the bills that fund the government. I think that Speaker McCarthy has made the decision that he's going to allow the previous one of those avenues, investigations, to go forward pretty much as the members want, in the hopes that when he gets to these tougher decisions about funding the government and confronting the administration over spending levels, that he will have greater flexibility coming from his members. I don't know if it'll work that way, but that's what I think he's hoping. I also, by the way, think that's why he was praising President Trump quite a bit at the end. He got a lot of flack for that. I can almost guarantee you, in the back of his mind, he thought, we got enough problems coming up. I don't need Trump after me.
Well, thank you. And your talk about oversight and investigations is a great lead in to our episode for next week. That's what we're going to be talking about, is the oversight system of Congress. And we are right at the top of the hour, and we just want to thank you so much for your time. You really educated all of us very much. And I know I was a chief of staff on the Hill, and I learned things today. So thank you. And Janine, do you want any parting comments that you want to give?
Yes, actually I do. I'm so glad I got a second, because, you know, you were talking about, Mr. Weber, that Speaker Gingrich, some of the Republicans were vulnerable to go vote for a Democrat, and whereas McCarthy, there weren't any Republicans that would really vote for a Democrat. But I remember watching, there became this very vulnerable moment in the whole drama when suddenly there was a question that, oh, I know what it was. A lot of people were leaving and they didn't know what the count was on the floor. And if so enough Republicans had left, then suddenly the Democrats might have the majority for the vote and the Democrats might get the speakership. And you saw this drama play out, and I saw Matt Gaetz' face, Representative Matt Gaetz, I saw his face, and that's when he turned and said, okay, I'll vote, I'll do a president, or, I'll change, I'll make this happen. And it was during that entire drama where they thought it might actually go to the Democrats. And I just thought that was, do you remember that moment? It was,
Yeah, I do. And
really
there were a couple of members that had fairly compelling reasons to leave, like one, a miscarriage. One member's wife had a miscarriage, I believe. It wasn't just that they got lazy or they decided to go out and hang one on at the neighborhood bar. They had compelling reasons to leave, and yet they had to stay around to get this done. I do remember that, Janine. Yes.
Yeah, it was amazing drama. Okay, thank you so much for coming on today. It was a great show, and thank our panel, and I thank everybody for listening and for all the schools. And it was another great show. Thank you, Kathy, as well.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank y'all.
Especially knowing it was funded by a guy with a connection to Minnesota. That's really great.
Well, thank you. And we will see y'all next week, Tuesday, 2 o'clock, where we'll be talking about oversight in the Congress. So please join us.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.